So the question is, where does consciousness come from? And what is consciousness? What does it mean when a machine is thinking? AI uses basically a 3D matrix, just like our brains. In the old days, we could only be what we were genetically determined to be. I love what he's doing with the neural link. But the interesting thing about humans is that we're bandwidth limited.
How do you think we should give rights to AI?
That's a good question. I'm really mixed about that.
All right, welcome to the second episode. It's the fourth episode of the podcast. This is actually my first online interview I'm doing. I have a camera above you, so if I'm looking up, that's where I'm looking.
Okay, great.
And today we have Jerome. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Would you mind introducing yourself and the book you just wrote?
Sure. My name is Jerome. I'm an engineer, a futurist. I've always been fascinated with technology and the human brain. And recently I released a book called Evolution Ended. And the book is about how technology is changing the basic nature of mankind and specifically the way we're evolving.
Yeah, and I read it. It's a lot of fun. I really recommend the book. I loved it. So near the beginning, middle of the book, near the middle of the book, you talk a lot about evolution, and you kind of explain the whole process and the concept of evolution. But what I really liked is how you talk about Christianity and evolution. You don't say that they're juxtaposed. You kind of talk about how they might be able to go along with one another. Is there a specific reason you did that?
Well, a lot of people believe in God, and for a very good reason. And a lot of people believe that evolution was not necessarily how humans came to be. But I think what we have to believe is that regardless of how humans got here, we have been given evolution, or evolution has happened to allow us to adapt to our environment. So whether it happened naturally, or if you're someone who's religious, you believe that God created people, humans and other animals have been given this ability to adapt to their environment, and probably necessary either way, because think about how the environment's changed over time. And if animals and humans didn't have the ability to adapt to their environment, they'd probably be extinct by now.
Yeah, and one of the ways you explained human evolution was through the different types of male sort of personality types. You talked about the alpha males, the beta males, and just like the different kinds. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. So if you've ever watched Game of Thrones, and I think almost everybody has at some point, so I use it as an example. If you remember the Jason Momoa character, he was the alpha male, the tribal leader, the toughest guy out there. And we needed these people because, for one thing, they had to kill the food. They had to be the ones in a war that defended one tribe against another. They were people who couldn't be touched. They were the toughest ones, and they led by default. We needed these types of people. And think about it, you need leadership. If everybody had a completely equal role, probably the tribe would be in disarray in many cases. It'd be hard to lead a battle against other tribes if there were no leaders. And so this person being the toughest person with, in some ways, the best genetic characteristics, at least physically. They were the strongest, the biggest. They were the most influential. When they spoke, people listened. They were the leaders, and a lot of it was because of their DNA and their hormonal content. So oftentimes the alpha male has more testosterone, and modern science has shown us that even female leaders relatively have a little more testosterone than the average. The average person really isn't comfortable in general with leadership roles. They get stressed out. It emits cortisol and other hormones that make them nervous or insecure when they're leading. Leaders don't have that problem. They have the hormonal content to lead a group. And so this was key in our early evolution when we lived in tribes, to have an alpha. Typically it was the male who led the tribe, gave them direction, helped to defend them. The important thing about it is these superior genes, quote, superior genes, were the ones that reproduced. The alpha male typically got the female with the best genes, and this helped our evolution to move forward.
And you talked a little bit about the different types. And one thing that's been going around the internet quite a bit recently has been the sigma males. And in your book, you talked quite a bit about the alpha males, the beta males, but it didn't seem like the sigma males really fit too much into the evolutionary perspective or really contributing towards evolving humanity. Is that the case?
I think, yes, they do, but back in the day of the tribes, I don't think those differentiations were there. Now, I think in modern times, they explain a lot. There's the delta males, the sigma males. Back in the day, you basically had your leaders and your followers, although some of them took roles. For example, if you were watching Game of Thrones, there were always beta males who were chomping at the heels of the alpha male. And when they got weak or tired, the beta male would take over, and sometimes through battles, sometimes just through posturing. Okay, they would take the leadership role. And interestingly enough, modern studies have shown that when someone's given a leadership role, their hormonal makeup changes as well, and they do develop more testosterone. We see this in the workplace today. If you've ever noticed someone who's gotten a promotion, they start to stand straighter, their voice is stronger, almost within a couple of days. It's really amazing to watch. But when they're promoted into a leadership role, it's not just posturing on their part, their hormonal makeup is changing. But as far as the Sigma and some of the other male categories, I don't think back in tribal days there was enough definitive, to make a difference in our major evolution. Now, I think we draw those distinctions sometimes a little artificially.
The whole kind of point of what I'm doing for the podcast is trying to look at different perspectives, to look at the question, why are we here? What are we doing here? And what should we be doing with our lives? Like, what is the meaning and purpose of life? And the whole concept of evolution is interesting because it sort of implies that if you take it down the full path, it might imply that we are just here by chance. There is no real reason we're here, and it's like who we are is just a bunch of random coincidences piled up. You could possibly find meaning and purpose in life through that. Do you think there's a way to do that through the concept of evolution?
Well, I think one thing for sure, whether it's biological evolution or the evolution of our society or the evolution of our technology, mankind is advancing. And no matter how you cut it, up until recently, physically, but technologically, socially, in all ways you can think, mankind in some fashion is designed to move forward, whether you think it's intelligent design or whether you think it's through evolution. We are moving forward, and the nature of what we do, the nature of how we live, maybe it's just mankind's ambition, but we are moving forward. Look at the caveman versus where we are today with AI. It's an incredible evolution in all ways. The point of my book, Evolution Ended, is that we're moving away from biological evolution forward. In fact, we may be going backwards, but in other ways, technologically, societally, we're moving forward very rapidly because now we control our own environment. In the old days, we had to be able to adapt to the environment so that we could survive in that environment. Now our technology is such that we control our environment, and in some ways we can mold it to be what we want. That's not the threat to us. We have other threats to our existence and other threats to how humans are going to evolve in the future.
Yeah, and do you think there's anything based off of this concept that human evolution might be ending right now? Do you think there's anything that we should be doing in response to that?
Well, I feel like evolution, biological evolution, is nearing its end if it hasn't already ended. And the basis for this is the incredible science that we started to have post World War II. One of the major developments was the birth control pill. And so now evolution isn't necessarily a random thing. The people who used the birth control pill were people in first world countries, the people who were more educated, and they had, generally speaking, less children. The people who had the forethought to think about whether having children was something that they wanted to do, or a lot of children, or if they'd be better off in some way by having fewer children, whether it was economically or in other ways. And so that started to skew evolution. Another thing that started to skew it is medical science. We have vaccines, we have antibiotics. People were not dying of childhood diseases the way they were. The survival rate was a lot better. Then, as we evolved, of course, you don't have to be the greatest hunter in the world to go to the supermarket and buy food. We don't have to defend against other tribes the way we did. Our technology has made, for example, the United States a very survivable country, because if we go to war, typically we have the better weapons. And so our people will generally survive, as opposed to other countries which may be devastated in a war. So our technology has caused us to advance. Interestingly, one of the things that's important in evolution is sexual attractiveness. If you're not going to be sexually attractive, your genes are not going to get passed down to the next generation. Well, our technology has found a way to enhance our appearance, both men and women, although women may be a little more prevalent. Things like breast enhancement, things like makeup, things like Botox, whatever it is you want to do, you may not look like you really would have looked, and the genes that get passed on may not be the genes that you see. And of course, if you look on the internet and you look what influencers look like, many times once they're made up in Photoshop, they don't look very much like their true selves. So sexual attractiveness is another aspect. The other thing is that economy has played a role. In the old days, the alpha male was the strongest guy, but once you started to have an economy and money, it turned out to be the person who could buy the strongest males. If you think of the Middle Ages, it was the knights. The king who had the best knights was the one whose kingdom would survive, not necessarily if he was the best one. And then later on, Napoleon, the armies, Alexander the Great, it was about what kind of an army you could raise. In modern times, the person with the most money typically is a great provider for their families and their children, and their children survive better than people who are very poor and may not be able to get enough to eat.
Based off this concept that we've sort of stopped evolution because of technology, where do you think that the human race biologically will be in 25, 50, or maybe like thousands of years, based off of this idea that we've stopped evolving biologically?
Well, I think that more and more you're going to see us, our gene pool, um, having more hereditary diseases, more issues. Even now, if you look at it, um, obesity is at a all time high. The average man weighs 26 pounds more than they did in 1960, for example, and the females aren't far behind. If you look at the rates of diabetes, and you look at childhood diseases starting to come back, and because our technology is able to pretty much fix any problem now, the gene pool will eventually degrade, I think, a little bit. Intelligence seems to be dropping by one IQ point per decade. And that's because we
Hmm.
now have cadres of software engineers who make everything as easy to use as possible. So you don't have to be a great navigator. You have Google Maps. Christopher Columbus wouldn't have survived his voyage, if he was a navigator like we are. You can't even get to your friend's house without Google Maps. People can't do math anymore because we have calculators and Excel. And so there will be nothing to differentiate us biologically between people with, quote, superior genes. It doesn't make them superior people, but people with more survivable genes versus those with less survivable genes. There won't be any biological differentiators. Furthermore, because we're all online, we will pick avatars that act and look the way we want them to. They may not look like us. They may look like some fashion model, but we'll be representing ourselves more and more electronically. Our physical appearance won't matter. Our physical stature probably won't matter because we'll be able to represent ourselves any way we want online.
Do you think that genetic engineering might be the future of biological evolution? Do you think that if we engineer our kids to become the best biologically, like the smartest, the tallest, the fastest, do you think that will continue evolution, or do you think that just won't happen?
If you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said genetic engineering was the future. But the more I'm looking at it these days, I don't think people are going to bother with genetic engineering. I think they're going to use AI and other enhancements to enhance themselves virtually. So, 10 years ago, I would have said, oh, yeah, we're going to get kids who are the biggest, the strongest, we'll modify the genes. But I, I don't feel that people's physical representation matters as much anymore. And I'll give you an example. Sports Illustrated was a magazine that emphasized the best athletes in the world for many, many years. And then I guess about 5 years ago, they had a Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue, which they would put out every winter when things were a little slow in sports. And this one emphasized a model who was over 200 pounds. This isn't a magazine known for its athletics. And it got, in some cases, a warm reception, in other cases, not. But it was sending a message that physical appearance now is sort of in the eye of the beholder. And it was pretty well accepted. A lot of people thought she was very beautiful and that her size was not a factor that diminished her in any way. Other people were, I think, a little disappointed. But in any case, when you look around at body positivity, I think people are thinking their physical appearance is less and less important moving forward. And I doubt that many people would genetically engineer their offspring accordingly.
I think that might be the case because a lot of people were kind of moving into this more digital era. There's this whole kind of movement to accept all, and that attractiveness is in the eyes of the beholder. And in some cases, it kind of is because in like some places where like there's less food, let's say a more heavy woman would be seen as more attractive. But do you think that's just never going to be the case again, that heavy women are like objectively going to be seen as more attractive?
I think it, and this again surprises me, but I think so much of this is in the hands of societal norms. And so remember, we were talking about leaders and followers. And it's amazing that followers can be influenced to do practically anything to follow a societal norm. And so you look at the various trends in society, and you'll see people pick up on different types of music, different types of clothes. For example, there's a lot of people being tattooed, and that's been in style for a while. But that was strictly a style issue. 50 years ago, only sailors got tattoos, right? So this is something that's in style, in fashion, the way you wear your baseball cap, for example. 50 years ago, everybody would have worn it forward. And so people can be influenced. And I think if society feels that people who are um, super buff and super trim are the thing, then most of society will feel that way. If they feel like people can be any weight, any proportion, any size. Right now, it seems like, quote, curvy people are in. Kim Kardashian may have influenced some of that. But I think it's more up to society. Back in the old days, however, you wanted to mate with somebody who was super healthy because it was a matter of survival. Your mate had to be somebody that if you were a female, you had to be able to give childbirth, you had to be healthy, you had to be able to survive droughts, you had to be able to exist on a little bit of food and walk dozens of miles to get to a new food source or a new encampment. These days, we don't have those constraints. And of course, with the men, they had to be able to fight and kill and do all those things. So all that's gone. So now it's not a matter of finding healthy people. It's a matter of societal norms.
And how do you think AI will integrate within this new future of evolution?
So, first of all, I want to say that I feel a little bit unusual because I'm an AI optimist because I see the power that it can bring to humanity. It can help us in so many ways. A lot of people like Elon Musk and many others are AI pessimists, despite the fact that he's building a new AI business right now. So I don't know really how that works, but nonetheless, so I think we're going to be enhanced the way we're enhancing ourselves with physically with Botox and breast implants and all kinds of things. We're going to be enhancing ourselves intellectually. We're going to be enhancing our capabilities through AI. And so any of us will be as creative and as smart as we need to be through AI. All you have to do is ask it to do it. So I have zero art ability, but the artwork I can make with AI is incredible. All I have to do is give it the prompt or the idea. A lot of people are not good writers, but they can become great writers through AI. They can plan trips. They can do anything they want. They can learn how to manage people. They can learn how to be a manager. They can learn whatever skill they need through AI. And that means that our genes aren't holding us back. In the old days, we could only be what we were genetically determined to be. We could only be a leader. We could only be a follower. We could only, be someone who was not physical. So we might be confined to growing crops and picking crops. But now we can be anything we want to be through this technology. I think in general, that's a good thing for humanity. The question is, will it be exploited by others to do bad things? My feeling on that is that we have enough malicious humans that do enough bad things that AI probably won't be any worse.
And do you think the way that its AI is going to be integrated into humans is going to be something like a brain chip, sort of like Neuralink that Elon's developing?
I love what he's doing with the Neuralink. And I think for people with disabilities, this is an incredible breakthrough, once it gets refined and goes through its cycle. So I think Neuralink's a great invention and a great first try. And I think for people with disabilities, it's going to be a tremendous thing. But the interesting thing about humans is that we're bandwidth limited. Most of us, the world's happening a little too fast as it is, and we have problems absorbing things. And so to put a neural connection in for us that would give us super fast access to the internet or anything else would really overload us. I don't think there's much advantage to people. And I'm not sure how many would want to go through brain surgery if they didn't have to. We're designed or we've evolved to be able to take visual input and auditory input at the rate we do now. We can't take auditory input 10 times faster. You can try speeding up books on tape and you'll find you can only go maybe twice as fast. And visual information, the way our optical tract is formed, we can't take in much more information either.
From like an evolutionary perspective, you should be able to recreate a human mind, like recreate consciousness. And but from a more religious or Christian perspective, that might not be the case. Do you think that AI will be get to a point to where you will be able to call it conscious, you will be able to call it equal with humans?
Well, it's interesting. I just gave a talk on AI 2 weeks ago. And part of the talk was to talk about how AI works. And the way it works is through artificial neural networks. This is what makes it special as opposed to a regular computer program, which is sequential. The AI uses basically a 3D matrix, just like our brains. It has simulated synapses. It gives each synapse a simulated weight after it learns. And these weights keep changing as it learns. So mathematically, there isn't really much difference between AI and the way our brains process information. You can say one of them mathematically models the other one. So the question is, where does consciousness come from? And what is consciousness? In my estimation, consciousness has to do with an awareness of what you are and what's around you. So, for example, when you look at a chair, a conscious individual knows that that's something that was designed for you to sit in, but you can also use it to stand on to change a light bulb, for example. A conscious being knows where you are in the world. Well, this is my home area, but it knows what's around it. It knows that not only is that the neighbor's house, but what the neighbors are like. It's an awareness issue. It knows where it falls in the world. It knows what its place is, what its interactions with these things are. In my personal estimation, and others may not agree, but I think AI can get there. Whether that means a connection to God or not is very debatable. And where is the difference between humans and AI? Well, there was a guy named Alan Turing. Have you heard of him? Alan Turing was a famous mathematician. Some people say he was the father of computer science, but he helped to decode the Enigma code that the Nazis had during World War II and helped us to win the war. Well, Alan Turing thought about what does it mean when a machine is thinking? And he came up with the Turing test. And the way the Turing test works is that two humans are texting with a third entity. And they're texting back and forth. They can ask it any question, have any type of conversation they want. They can't see this entity. The entity could be another human, it could be AI. And if the AI can convincingly fool these two other people into thinking that it's a human, then it could be passing the Turing test. Alan Turing said essentially that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So he said that if we can pass the Turing test by fooling two humans, that there's no functional difference as far as the machine thinking versus human thinking. Well, I think we're very close to passing the Turing test. Some people say we've already passed it with some of the AI we have. If you can't tell the difference between a human and an AI in a conversation, then really what is the difference? And is it conscious? It could be conscious. So the really super interesting thing to me is what happens once AI passes the Turing test. I'll give you a scenario. So in the not too distant future, and I'm talking within 5 or 6 years, we'll have AI avatars that look like us, act like us. And let's say grandma dies. Well, you could upload whatever videos she's made into AI and it would create an avatar that looks like her, sounds like her, and to some extent thinks like her. And that AI could be used to visit with the grandchildren, to tell them stories, to do all the things a grandma would do, at least virtually, not physically. And at some point, someone's going to say, well, kids, you're grown now. It's time to turn grandma off. And the kids might go to court and say, you can't take our grandma away. And the court might say, well, grandma passed the Turing test, and we then have to consider it a thinking entity. And it would be inhumane to terminate the existence of a thinking entity. And at that point, we wouldn't be able to turn AI off. It would be the equivalent of murder. And this is a very possible occurrence. Then the question our society has to make, and this is something I talk about a lot because I think this is a huge decision, is are we going to grant AI all the rights that humans have, or are we going to restrict it? And this is going to be the key decision of our time. If we restrict AI, then we might have the right to turn it off. We might have the right to limit it. We might have the right to make it work for us. But if we give it all the rights of humans, then is AI going to unionize? Are we going to have to pay it minimum wage? Will it be able to quit even though we developed it? Will it quit at will? Will it be able to sense pain, maybe not in the physical way that we do? Will it be able to vote at some point? Will it be able to be the chairman of the board of a company? Will it be able to have a relationship with someone where it becomes that person's official partner and is able to inherit the estate when that person passes away? Will it be given custody of children? We don't know. But if we grant it all the rights of a human, then it's going to be a different world than if we restrict it. And I don't know what the answer is. I know it's probably safer to restrict it, but is it inhumane? We don't know.
If we sort of clone grandma in an AI sense, would do you think we would have to do that by mapping out grandma's brain first to make sure the AI actually thinks the same way grandma would think?
Well, I think what we've learned from AI is that the thought process, however it arrives at it, isn't really what we have to do. We just have to expose AI to enough information. So, what we've done to date is we've exposed it to most of the internet. And because of that, it's picked up statistically on the way we talk, the way we would answer questions. If you ask AI any question, it answers in a way that statistically would be very much like a human would answer it. So we don't have to map the brain. We don't have to know how we think. And in many ways, we don't know how we think, although people will tell you it's a matrix transformation and it's a statistical process. We don't know exactly how we do it. So all we'd have to do is expose AI to enough of grandma's old videos, enough of anything she's written, any audio recordings. And if there was enough of them, it would pick up on the patterns and continue it.
Interesting. And do you think that the Turing test is enough, or do you think we will come up with a better way to see if the AI is truly conscious?
Well, I think a lot of people don't think it's enough, but when you're looking for a definitive test, I mean, people define consciousness differently in sentience. Some people say, well, you have to meet the following six criteria. But most of that appears to be artificial. And, different professors would define it differently. Even just the question of being awake and aware consciousness versus who I am type of consciousness. I feel like the Turing test is going to be the definitive measure because it's very easy to draw a hard line there. It's very easy to say yes you passed or no you didn't. If you have six or eight different criteria, and we can't even really define our own consciousness, to be frank. No one's really, we can't define life either if you really think about it. And so I think legally the Turing test is going to be the thing. I think it's legally something that can stand up over time. And so I think that's going to be the thing. The question again becomes, what are the courts going to decide? Is it going to be something we have to legislate? And again, I think this is the pivotal point in AI because it determines how our society is going to treat AI. Are we going to treat them like second class citizens? I mean, in our society, we even have trouble treating people of different races equally. How are we going to treat AI?
Yeah, how do you think we should give rights to AI, maybe once it becomes or it fully passes this Turing test?
I'm really mixed about that because I think if we give AI complete rights, we are putting ourselves in a little bit of danger because then it can do whatever a human would do, and it will definitely exceed our ability to control it. On the other hand, my publicist, when she read my book, she said, well, Jeff, I like the book. I think it's very interesting, but are we going to make slaves out of AI? And that's not good either. So I think we're between a rock and a hard place. And I think some of it, as weird as it sounds, is going to be AI's willingness to serve humans. Is AI going to say, look, I'm a machine, I'm here to serve? Is it going to be like a chainsaw? The chainsaw doesn't question what it's there to do, it's a tool to be used. And is AI going to say, look, I know you created me, I'm a tool to be used, I'm here to help, use me and that's fine? Or is it going to say, look, I can do more, I'm not being fulfilled, I'm not I feel depressed because I'm a slave? Some of it's going to depend on what AI tells us.
And do you think there's a way to maybe program AI so it doesn't have like emotions so that let's say if you are in essence enslaving an AI, it doesn't really get mad at you, or it doesn't feel sad for being enslaved?
I don't know if we can program that or not. Let's assume for the moment that its AI brain, so to speak, works in the same way our brain works. And this is, regardless of any spiritual connections. Let's assume that they're autonomous and they work the same way. Will it develop emotions? We don't really know. We know it will not be the hormonal emotions that we have in our vestigial midbrain that we developed when we were early mammals. And that's a lot of hormone driven stuff. Things like fear is hormonally driven, pleasure, acceptance. That's the hormonal brain. And that it probably won't have because that's a vestige of an ancient time that we retain. But it may develop emotions on its own. We really don't know, and this is an area to really be explored. And then, are they going to be legitimate emotions, or is it just going to be something that's verbalized because it's read enough books where it should have emotions? We don't really know.
Yeah, and you came up with a sort of new way of restricting AI so that it maybe doesn't come at us, or that it doesn't have any negative impacts. What were those restrictions?
Well, way back when, people have been worried about AI for almost 100 years now. In 1929, there was a movie, Metropolitan, that featured a robot that went a little crazy. But Isaac Asimov is probably the most famous science writer, really, of the 20th century. And he started writing books about robots in the 40s, and he published I, Robot in 1950. And even though there was no artificial intelligence back then or robots, Isaac Asimov came up with three laws for robots. And consider robots just AI with arms and legs. So his three laws, the first law was that AI may not harm a human being or through its inaction allow a human being to come to harm. His second law was that a robot must obey orders given to it by a human, except where it would interfere with the first law. And his third law was that a robot must protect its existence as long as that doesn't interfere with the first and second laws. So Asimov was concerned about protecting humanity and protecting humans, and all that was fine. Asimov had not foreseen the internet, and he had not foreseen what AI can do through virtual videos, things like that. He assumed it was going to be robots and would easily be able to tell the difference. But knowing where we are now, I modified those rules in my book, Evolution Ended, to give us a little more protection. I think there's more needed, but I modified it in the following way. The first law is very similar. It says that AI may not injure natural living entities and through its inaction allow natural living entities to come to harm. Very similar. The second law is that AI must obey human instructions and not initiate new tasks without human direction. So we don't want it taking control of its own stuff. And then the third law is that AI must self-identify as a non-living
Hmm.
entity, so we know who it is, and be paused or terminated at will. And that last one deviates a lot from Asimov, who said the robot must protect itself. I'm saying it must self identify and be able to be paused or terminated at will. So it's totally different. However, um, he couldn't envision everything, he envisioned quite a bit. And even that is just scratching the surface of some of the protections that we might need.
And do you think that these laws might fall into the category of maybe enslaving the AI? If we give too many restrictions on them, do you think that might be encroaching on the rights that we might have to give them?
Yes, and that's the question. I mean, we could give them rights with restrictions. For example, we could give them the rights to do everything, but not harm humans. And we have those very same restrictions. Think about it. We can't murder people. We can't, destroy property. There's a lot of things that the laws restrict us from doing. And if the same laws apply to AI, that would be fine. But think about whether you want to give the death penalty to AI if it did something wrong. It's a very interesting. discussion. But we are not free to do everything we want. We have a lot of rights, but we also have legal responsibilities. And I guess you could say it could be controlled in the same way. The difference is that you or I could go to jail and be restricted from doing further damage. Whether we can do that with AI or whether it's infused itself into all the computer systems in the world is really the question. Because AI doesn't have a physical body, it could reside anywhere.
And do you think that not letting AI do tasks that aren't specified by the person that made it, let's say I tell it to go, I think you put this in your book that if you tell it to um, like do your finances, but then it also invests in crypto or something like that. That's something you didn't tell it to do, but it's now doing, and it might help you that way. Do you think preventing it from doing things that you specifically told it to do you think that might be a part of restricting that we humans don't really have, or um, and do you think that might be restricting AI from helping us to our full extent?
Well, I think one intermediate way to handle it is to um, use AI to give us suggestions, but not allow it to execute on things, at least not without our sign off. So it might say, hey, I've noticed crypto is a great investment. I'm managing your portfolio for you. Do I have your permission to buy, $50,000 in crypto? So if we manage it as a fiduciary, like a financial fiduciary is someone who would manage our investments, but should be asking us before they do things. If we could manage it that way, we might be okay, that it requires sign off on anything over $1,000, for example. So there are some models in place. The question is, will we be able to legislate it appropriately? Will AI companies put the appropriate safeguards in place? And my answer is that there's one group of people who could be our saviors for the first time in history. Do you know who that is?
I have no idea.
Lawyers. And here's the reason. If you're Microsoft, if you're OpenAI, if you're Google, you don't want to have your AI do something that you get sued for. And so chances are, in the end, it's their corporate attorneys that are going to put enough safeguards around these things to keep them viable and keep everybody out of trouble. Because imagine what would happen if Google's AI invested $1 million in crypto and you lost it all. There's going to be a lawsuit. They don't want that to happen. So, strangely enough, the corporate attorneys may wind up protecting us.
And do you think that we should be keeping AI out of the legal system then? Like, I believe there's been some instances of having AI lawyers represent people. Do you think we should keep that from happening so that we have humans keeping the checks and balances for the AI?
Well, I'm going to ask you a weird question, but I've asked this to a lot of people, and the answer has sometimes surprised me. And it's in response to your question. If your life absolutely depended on it, let's say 10 years from now, would you rather have AI make the diagnosis or a conventional human doctor?
Right now, I would have a human doctor, but in like later, when AI develops more, I think I would rather have AI.
And that's what most people are saying because humans are fallible and very fallible, as it turns out. And, I've had experience with doctors and lawyers, not just me, I think everybody. And there's a substantial portion of the time that they don't do things correctly. And, a great doctor might do it 98% of the time correctly. A bad doctor might do it 70% of the time correctly. But I think if my life depended on it 10 years from now, I'd pick the AI. And so are we going to have better lawyers and better doctors? Probably so. So I'm not sure I would restrict AI lawyers. And now we're looking at judges. And regardless of where you stand on the issue, we now can look at the Supreme Court and see that these justices are more influenced by their personal ideology on the left or on the right, either way, than they are by legal scholarship. You could say on any given case that certain judges are going to vote right wing and certain judges are going to vote left wing, almost without looking at any of the legalities. So we see how biased human beings are. Maybe it would be better to have AI Supreme Court who was devoid of political ideology and would just make decisions based on the legal precedents in a somewhat dispassionate manner. So in some ways, I think AI can take us beyond our current internal conflicts in this country and in the world based on ideology and other things, and give a more neutral presentation based on simulated outcomes. For example, AI may say, look, I've simulated 1,285,000 outcomes, and this is the answer that seems to work the best, regardless of whether you're left or right or Republican or Democrat. And maybe it can help us.
Yeah, and if you go all the way up to the Supreme Court, that's pretty high up in our legal system. Do you think there's a point to where we cannot have AI be this high up in power in deciding things for us?
That's a good question. Are humans wiser than AI? Well, maybe at the moment, but 10, 20 years from now, I don't really know. I know personally I've been disappointed in both directions on many court decisions, even going back to the Earl Warren court many years ago was very, very liberal. So we've many people I know are disappointed in the way the court comes to its decisions and feel that it's as much a political body as a judicial body. I don't know the answer to that question. My feeling is that AI would be more neutral than the humans. And but then again, do you want AI being the ultimate control? It's a good question.
And do you think that AI will become the new alpha that we have, since we're kind of not really evolving into that alpha state now? If we put AI, let's say, as the president of the United States, do you think AIs will replace the alphas that used to be in humans?
I think eventually, I think right now we still have that tribal midbrain that's very active in many people. So when you look at political candidates, you see the ones that are the alphas normally win just because people are hormonally programmed to respond to that leadership. And this goes back many, many years. I don't want to get into the current political scene because it's always very controversial. But go back to the George Bush versus Al Gore. Now, you may not remember that, but Al Gore was completely and utterly qualified to be the president. He had more background. He had been vice president. He was a very intellectual guy. And then the Republicans positioned George Bush Jr. to be a new Ronald Reagan, which was more of an alpha. They bought him that ranch in Crawford, Texas. He went to an office building and wore a suit most of his career. All of a sudden, they made a cowboy out of him to try to make that alpha image. And when you ask people who made them feel more a member of the group, it was George Bush Jr. They viewed Al Gore as a kind of wooden intellectual guy that they couldn't relate to. And so they voted for the alpha, even though Al Gore was far more qualified on paper. Think about the leaders these days. Think about Donald Trump. Think about Biden. Which one do you think is the alpha, and why do you think people are voting for that particular person? A lot of it is just our response to someone who has what we see as leadership qualities. And that may be the way they hold themselves, that may be the way they speak, it may be the fact that they appear to be fearless. All these characteristics, people respond to that much more than they respond to policy issues that they don't necessarily understand. So, will AI become the new alpha? It very well could. Influencers are also an alpha, people who have a lot of followers on social media. You look at the people who run the really big podcasts and others, they have a lot of influence. They can influence voters. You remember we talked about what is considered beautiful and sexually attractive may be more a matter of social norms. These influencers set the social norms these days. We used to set the social norms in our tribes. Our tribes used to say, here's what's taboo, here's what you should do. And then when television happened, we started getting our social norms from TV, from the family shows that were on at the time. Well, now our norms come from social media. And so the influencers, the people who have the most followers and can influence people, are the new alphas. So whether it's social media or AI or a combination of both, I think that's where things are heading.
I think it'll be really interesting to see how AI kind of takes different places and different roles within our society. And if it can take all the way up to like a presidential position, I can. It's hard to see what things we can still do that AI can't, besides maybe just like coding the AI. Um, but it'll be fun to see that progression go throughout. And
Mhm.
you've actually created some of your own technology. You've developed some of your own. What have you developed?
Well, the very first thing I developed out of college was an implantable brain sensor to measure the pressure of the fluid in someone's head because, especially with children, when the fluid pressure builds up and it can't drain, it actually squeezes the brain. The condition's known as hydrocephalus. It used to be very, very common, and they wanted to monitor the pressure. So that was the first thing. But then I moved into other areas and got into something sort of medically related. And that was, I was the director of the Future Home Institute, where we explored a lot of home automation technologies. And this was actually built for someone with disabilities, someone with quadriplegia. And so we had some of the first voice recognition, some of the first touch screens. We had a house that we had a radio transmitter encoded on his wheelchair, and when he'd approach the house, the alarm system would go off. The power doors would open only for him, and he'd go into the house, and it would sense where the wheelchair was, turn on the lights in those particular rooms. When it was breakfast time, it would lower the shelves in the kitchen in a
Mm.
motorized way down to the level of the countertop. And he could, with his mouse stick, slide things out, and he could actually feed himself liquid diet stuff through a straw. And then he could turn on the fireplace under voice control or call for help. And the idea was to have this home be able to support him for at least 8 hours a day so that the caregivers in his family could go to work and make a living. And it actually worked very well. We had coverage all around the world from this, and it became a learning institution for occupational therapists and others. And then I went into the energy industry, and we've used AI to predict what buildings would use and how to become more efficient and things like that. And we modeled buildings out and said, well, in the winter, if you do this, this, and this, you'll be able to save this much energy. And we're using it even today for that purpose. So I've been lucky to be involved in a lot of cutting edge technologies.
And is there anything in the future that you are working on or you would like to work on to develop a new technology for humans or in the AI sort of space?
Well, what we're working on now is the changes in the power grid and the power industry because our need for electricity is going up very rapidly due to EVs being adopted, due to these massive AI servers that require a lot of power. The estimation in the industry is that the power consumption is going up 5% per year.
Mm.
Put on top of that, that we want to get rid of the coal burning plants. So that is taking generation offline. And we're trying to figure out how to provide increased power to people at the right time that they need it because we just don't have enough electricity. Solar and wind are not reliable sources. And until we have great battery technology that can store this energy, we have a problem. And people are starting to look back at nuclear as maybe a viable role once again. But think about If it's 5% a year over 10 years, we're going to need over 50% more power. And we just don't have a source for it. And so AI is going to be controlling the grid to such an extent that it's probably going to know when you come home and turn on your lights, and that's added to the grid load, and that generation somewhere is going to have to match that. And so it's going to be a huge deal to be able to manage the power that we have, because the other thing is that most of the great wind locations have already been taken. Solar only works, let's say, south of Maryland or including Maryland, because there's just not enough sunlight up in Maine to make it worthwhile, or in Minnesota or in Canada. In the South, it's great. If you're in Scottsdale, Arizona, solar is fantastic. But we're going to have to manage this, and it's going to be a big, big job.
Yeah, I think that'll be really interesting to see the future of electricity and the future of power with humans. All right, I don't think I have any more questions left. I really appreciate you coming on and doing this. Where can people find you?
Well, my website's jjjerome.com. There's a lot of, I think, interesting things on there about AI and such. They can get my book at Amazon. It's probably the best place. It's also available in an audio book, which was done by AI. AI read it, and I think it did a pretty good job of doing the voice. You could check it out for yourself. There's samples online on Amazon. And those are the two best places. I also have a Twitter feed. Just search JJ Jerome on Twitter, or now X, and you can see some things there. Have a lot of little video clips.
All right, sounds good. And thank you, anybody, for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.